So this event didn't just pop up in isolation. It's actually an event that has followed in the heels of another one that was organized in August. What happened in August was we had a forum that was entitled Genocide in Gaza, where there were a few speakers. It was held at the Penang Institute. And that was the result actually of just the collective effort of a few individuals, just loose individuals in Penang who felt that they recognized that there wasn't very much going on in Penang. And as far as this issue is concerned, there was relative silence, and we wanted to do something about it. So just as a collection of a few individuals through individual effort, we organized that forum, Genocide in Gaza, in August, very well attended, both physically and online. In the meantime, there have been other things. There have been fairs, there have been cultural gatherings, there have been sharings of the history of Palestine on at least one other occasion. And then eventually we decided to form ourselves into a group with a name, and that name became Palestine Solidarity Penang. So it still continues to be a small collection of individuals, all very busy, but in spite of that, exerting our efforts to do what we can. And today is another result of that series collection of disparate attempts. So as I was saying, the topic today is actually one of quite immense gravity, which is the ongoing genocidal war on a dispossessed and long oppressed people. The topic, as we know, is history of Palestine and the rise of colonial Zionism. I think that the present unprecedented round of violence and mass death has its roots in history, a history of injustice, a history of how one could say an ideology drawing on and finding support in imperialist interest, in God and the Bible, in compensation for the Nazi Holocaust, as well as in Europe's own anti-Semitism, how all that turned into a settler colonialist project, resulting in the dispossession and erasure of a native people. And that is a familiar theme in the history of colonialism. So today, with regards to that entire subject, we have with us someone who will help us understand what is going on now by helping us understand its roots in the past, in history. And that person is Muslim Imran. Muslim is a Palestinian scholar and activist. He contributes to the Palestinian cause. He's also a person who has been studying foreign relations, and right now he's on the verge, perhaps on the edge of the verge of completing a PhD in strategic and international studies at the University of Malaya. He's actually been in Malaysia for quite some time. He's from the West Bank. He came out of the West Bank, if I'm not wrong, around about 17, 18 years old. And he has a Malaysian family in KL. So Muslim will talk to us about the topic, history of Palestine and the rise of colonial Zionism, helping us to underpin what I think is action and compassion that's needed on the issue at hand. But before we listen to Muslim, we have another person who has been kind enough to share his time with us. And I can attest through my efforts in getting WhatsApp responses from this individual, how busy, how chock-a-block his schedule is, all of which I'm sure is dedicated to good activities for his constituents. And that person is YB Gooi Hsiao Leung, who is a member of the Penang State Legislative, is Penang member of the Penang State Legislature for the state constituency of Bukit Tengah. And the reason why we had invited Gooi, I appreciate the fact that Gooi appreciates not having to be called YB Gooi. I appreciate the fact that Gooi in May 2024, what he did was to put forward a motion in the State Assembly for support for an order that was issued by the ICJ in that same month to immediately stop its offensive and military operations in Rafah, southern Gaza at the time. Of course, that was in May and things were already bad enough for South Africa to propound that case and for it to then have subsequently evolved into a strong order for Israel to stop its offensive and military operations in Rafah and withdraw its troops. So that order was actually, to quote, stop inflicting conditions of life that would bring about the Palestinian group's physical destruction in whole or in part. A strong order. And what Gooi did, to great credit, was to put that as a motion forward to the State Assembly. And from what I read in the papers, it was passed unanimously. So Gooi will give us a few minutes of opening remarks to further set the stage before we then flick over to Muslim for the main content of the talk. And after that, of course, we will have Q&A. Those of you who are here in the room, better than anticipated attendance. And those of you who are online, please, by all means, jump in with questions and get a good discussion going later on. So Gooi, if you would kindly please give your opening remarks. So thank you.
Thank you. Look into the camera. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Tong, for the introduction. Friends of Aliran, thank you, Aliran. Muslim Imran. He reminded me earlier before the start of the program today that we met over maybe 10 years ago. So that was in Parliament in Kuala Lumpur when I was a member of Parliament then, and Imran was already very much involved and active in the solidarity, the Palestinian movement, and fighting for the Palestinian people. Anyway, back to the topic today. I think I have been invited here today really to give a little bit of story or basically background of what happened in the State Assembly, what the Malaysian context is in how we look at the Palestinian issue, and also what the Malaysian government have been doing with regards to the atrocities that have been committed in Palestine. I think no individual, no person in the world that follows or watches what happens in Palestine will not be affected by the immense suffering that is going on over there. And I think that it only really deserves everyone's empathy and some action, no matter how big or small on our part, to be able to do something and show solidarity with the people of Palestine, and of course, with the call to end the military operations and the atrocities that have been committed in Gaza right now, in particular. Coming back to the State Assembly, Tong, in November of last year, just after a month of the military action taken by Israel, after October 7th, of course. In November, when the State Assembly sat to meet, we generally have a meeting twice a year, not many times, but the state legislative meets twice a year. So in the meeting of November, the state governor, in fact, at that time, was very concerned about what was happening in Palestine. And basically in his speech to what, is a state parliament, expressed grave concern for the people of Palestine and had hoped that there would be a ceasefire and end to the violence that was going on in Gaza. At that time, during the State Assembly, after hearing the governor's speech, the Chief Minister of Penang, Yang Amat Muhammad Chow Kon Yeow, then also introduced a motion showing solidarity with the people of Palestine. It was a not debated motion. It was basically a read out motion in the House. And obviously, this issue touches a lot of people in Malaysia and is an issue that is close to many Malaysians, the majority of Malaysians. So in the State Assembly, it was passed unanimously at that time in November. By 6 months later, in May, there was another State Assembly meeting. And in that meeting, it rather at that time coincided what was happening in the ICJ and the ICC at that time. So with a case that was brought by South Africa at the time, ICJ had just made a ruling at that time, in essence, making an order to call for Israel to stop its military operations in Gaza. That was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 24th of May, right? And also at the same time, I remember the International Criminal Court prosecutor, Karim Khan, had also applied to the court to issue warrants of arrest against the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and also the former Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, right? So there was all these things that were happening at that time. And of course, the attacks, the relentless military action that was going on in Palestine, basically, we saw it as a time that we should also at the State Assembly do something about it. So we filed a motion, but before filing the motion, we actually talked to the other state assemblymen. And this included members of the opposition. And let me tell you, it's not easy in Malaysia to talk to members of the opposition. Usually we will argue over everything. But when it came to this particular issue, and when I approached them, I mean, without any reservation, basically, they all came on board and we all signed the motion and we presented it. And of course, we also got the opportunity to express our views during our debates in the State Assembly meeting, and it was passed, right, unanimously. So that was one thing, because we really, I mean, how I started earlier, when you see what is happening in Palestine, it's very difficult not to be affected. If I was even thinking, I mean, if you look at Gaza, and I was looking up on the internet, and the size of Gaza, I'm not sure if it's right, is about 140 square miles.
365 kilometers.
That's right, 365. Penang Island is about 114 square miles. It's not that much different. And if you try to picture the kind of devastation and suffering of the people in Palestine right now, 2 million people, over 1 million people displaced, 80% of the homes destroyed, infrastructure, roads, hospitals. And I try and picture that for Penang Island, and then you really get a sense of the unimaginable suffering that the people of Penang, people of Gaza is going through right now. So that was one aspect of it, right? And I also have to say that with regards to the government, the federal government, I think those of us who follow the news, our Prime Minister, Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim, has been extremely vocal about Palestine and the condemnation of the genocide that is being perpetrated right now by Israel. In every given opportunity, in every international meetings, he has never stopped talking about Israel and Palestine. Even last month when in Peru, during the APEC meeting, which is an economic and trade meeting, he spoke about it. Recently, just a few weeks ago at the Islamic Summit in Riyadh, he spoke about it. And some of the things are basically what he's saying is that there should be an arms embargo. Basically, you should ban export of arms by countries to Israel for them to use and perpetrate against the Palestinian people. That is one of them. And the more recent one, I think, which is more significant, is basically he's saying, Anwar Ibrahim is calling on the international community to try and get a world consensus that calling on Israel to be either suspended or expelled from the United Nations. Now, the reason being is that we all know that so many decisions have been made by the International Court of Justice, at least 3 decisions this year. We also have an International Criminal Court recently, just a couple of weeks ago, have issued a warrant of arrest for the Prime Minister. And we see that Israel continues to carry out its attacks against the people of Palestine with total impunity and disregard for international law. And really, I would argue that Israel has gone rogue. And if you don't, I mean, what is the point of having a United Nations? What is the point of having international law when nations can just simply ignore them and blatantly disregard them? So Anwar Ibrahim, the Malaysian government, has been very strong advocating for ceasefire to happen in Gaza. Moreover, I think you see small programs like this morning to bring awareness. There have been rallies and protests. Malaysians have also been raising money for the Palestinian cause. Malaysian government under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they have set up a humanitarian trust fund, which they target to raise 100 million for the Palestinians. And I think they are close to achieving that. And of course, I think in August, also Malaysian government had brought in families, victims from Palestine who needed medical treatment to receive medical treatment in Malaysia. So those are some of the things that are going on right now. And I think my wish personally is for, I mean, we all have to do whatever we can in the hopes that we can end the suffering of the people of Palestine and the war there, and that the people of Palestine can live with dignity and with freedom. So yeah, that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gooi. Much appreciated. Understand your comments. And with regards to what you just said, we all need to do what we can.
Yeah.
Not enough is being done. Not enough is being done, but still,
yeah.
One of the things that
Mr. Tong, you're too soft. Your sound's too soft.
That was a tech moment, very easily explained by the fact that the microphone wasn't on. So I was saying that thank you very much, Gooi, YB Gooi. We understand what you're saying, appreciate your remarks. A lot needs to be done. Not enough is being done, but certainly one of the ways in which anyone can do anything is to try and understand the causes, how it all started. And it's not just fighting for fighting's sake. It's not just people being unreasonable. There are reasons in history. And that's why we're trying to do this afternoon, to try and understand from that angle. And, with a better understanding, we can hopefully be pointed in the right direction. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Gooi.
Thank you.
So from here, Muslim, we would now have the opportunity to listen to a historical account of what we see going on right now, what the roots of it are. Muslim, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tong. A very good afternoon to you all. I'm very pleased to be here with you in Penang. And I wish to start by thanking Aliran and Mr. Tong for organizing this. I would like to also thank Hashim Sani Center for Palestine Studies in for connecting us in the first place. And I wish to thank each and every one of you who are present here physically in this place and those who are joining us online, and especially YB Gooi, who I am very glad to meet again after so many years, for his kind words just now on the Palestinian issue. We are very grateful to the great Malaysian nation for their strong commitment in support of the Palestinian struggle and in support of delivering justice in Palestine. Malaysia is a nation that has faced foreign colonial occupation for centuries, probably more than us in Palestine. And eventually you were successful in ending the colonial era and getting your own freedom, emancipation. And today we see Malaysia on the right course of development and progress. So I'm very thankful to all of our Malaysian friends for their support and solidarity. And I'm especially thankful to the people of Penang who are showing their solidarity also through the Penang Solidarity campaign, through the events. This morning there was an event in solidarity with Palestine, and through other forms and activities like the forum organized in August and this forum today. Honestly, I was mentioning this to Mr. Tong this morning. For us, the Palestinians, it is a must to do our best to liberate ourselves from colonialism and occupation. But for those who support this struggle here in Malaysia, in Europe, in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, you are doing right to yourself. You're standing by your own principles. You are standing for justice. You're standing for freedom. You're standing for human rights. So I am very grateful to each and every one of you for doing the right thing and for your stand, because many of you can carry on with business as usual and stay in your own comfort zone, not bother about what's happening few thousand miles away, but you choose to actually pick an interest in what's happening, and you choose to express your solidarity with the oppressed, and you choose to do something to end the injustice that has continued to take place in Palestine for over a century. Now, in my discussion today, in my presentation today, I want to highlight the root cause of the problem that we have today in Palestine. The problem that you see in Palestine and the Middle East did not start last year. It did not start 10 years ago. It did not start even 100 years ago. And interestingly, it did not start in the Middle East. It actually started somewhere else in Europe. So we will come to that. We will try to address that. We will try to explain how the whole problem started and how it is affecting our life in Palestine, in Gaza, and in West Asia in general today. You see a genocide taking place today in Gaza, or at least as the ICJ put it, a plausible case of genocide. You see war crimes and war criminals. The ICC now is charging the Israeli Prime Minister and the former Israeli Defense Minister. You see a humanitarian crisis, starvation, especially in North Gaza. You see an arms race in the Middle East, a humanitarian crisis, and a political crisis, which might, if not addressed, which might actually bring the whole world to World War III, God forbid. But the possibility is there. Maybe 10 years ago, I have a friend, a Russian friend, who used to always, some 10, 15 years ago, warn about the possibility of World War III. And me and friends used to laugh when he brings up such suggestions. But today, I don't think anybody will laugh when we talk about the possibility of World War III. It is actually, a possible development, God forbid. But in order to prevent that from happening, we all have to play a role. And sometimes we can end the problem before it gets bigger. Unfortunately, the human race in the 20th and the 21st century failed in addressing the root cause of the problem and in addressing it early on and in ending the ongoing injustice in Palestine and in stopping that extremist political force that continues to bring misery to West Asia, the Middle East, and the world. The Palestinians, coming back to the history of Palestine, have existed for thousands of years, like many other native nations and populations. But throughout history, we have had different political dynasties ruling Palestine. The very name of the land itself changed by time, and country names are political constructs. So Malaysia, 50 years ago, or let's say 70 years ago, was not called Malaysia. In 1957, when this land got independence, it was called Malaya. But a few years later, a new political construct was created in the name of Malaysia. And we never know about the future. We need maybe a fortune teller to guess with us, but who knows, you might in the future, in 10, 20, 50 years, merge with one of the neighboring countries and create a new political construct. So Palestine, the Palestinian people existed for thousands of years, but the name of the political entity changed over time. The earliest recorded existence of people or a culture and a civilization in Palestine is, of course, arguably that of Jericho. Jericho is one of the most ancient inhabited settlements in human history. It is now being considered together with Damascus and probably a few other ancient settlements in West Asia and Asia Minor. They are considered to be the earliest towns in the world history. When the human race decided to change their lifestyle from gatherer-hunters to agricultural communities, and the agricultural revolution happened some 10,000 years ago or more, Jericho emerged as one of the earliest settlements. So if you visit Jericho today, you will still see some archaeological evidence, testing to that. Since then, more communities started to settle in West Asia, especially in the area called now Palestine. We had one of the earliest human civilizations in the name of the Canaanite civilization. So the land started to be called the land of Canaan. And different political entities, different kingdoms emerged over the course of few thousand years. But in the Bronze Age and later in the Iron Age, a Canaanite civilization emerged. And a civilization is where you have a political and an economic order. So people started to develop towns and cities, like, in addition to Jericho, like Jerusalem, one of the ancient or most ancient inhabited cities in the world, like my hometown, Hebron, which emerged around the same time that Jerusalem emerged, and later became the host city to Prophet Ibrahim, and his children, like Nablus, one of the also the most ancient cities, Gaza, and other Palestinian towns and cities. And the Canaanites were relatively similar. They spoke different Semitic languages, but they were also sometimes politically different, and they welcomed different migrant communities. So amongst the migrant communities that came to Palestine was the Israelites, who are descendants of Abraham. So Ibrahim himself, Prophet Abraham, was actually an Iraqi. He moved, at least according to the scriptures that we have. He moved from Iraq, from Ur, and settled in Hebron, in Palestine. But there were also some European communities that migrated around the same period. One of these communities settled around the coastal area of Gaza, and they were later named the Philistines. Interestingly, this group gave its name to the whole land later. So around the period of the Romans, some 2,000 years ago, people stopped using the term Canaan, the land of Canaan, and started to use the more official term that the Romans adopted, Palestine or Palestina. But this group of people, the Philistines, who came from somewhere from Europe, merged with the larger Canaanite Semitic community. So they started to also speak Canaanite languages. They started to worship Canaanite gods. And they started to develop their own culture and civilization together with others. So we had the Israelites, we had the Philistines, and we had so many other communities, such as the Ammonites around modern-day Jordan, the Edomites. We had the Phoenicians, who invented the alphabets that we use. They had several city-states, not very different from the later Greek city-states of Athens, Sparta, and others. So the Phoenicians were a trading community. They settled in the northern regions of Palestine and settled in Lebanon, modern-day Lebanon, as well as the coastal areas of Syria. They migrated to Carthage later, in Tunisia, to the southern coastal areas of Spain and other Mediterranean regions. These different communities mixed, cooperated, sometimes fought each other, worshipped similar gods, probably ate similar food, spoke similar languages, be it ancient Arabic or Aramaic or Hebrew or any other Semitic language. And eventually, time passed. And no single political entity continued for centuries in the region. It was always small political entities that coexisted or fought. But Palestine, if you look at the map, is at a very interesting and important geopolitical position. It sits between three different continents. So we have Africa to the south, we have Asia to the east, and we have Europe to the north. Therefore, it has become the crossroads of so many civilizations. The ancient Egyptians conquered Palestine and sometimes were conquered by the Palestinians, the Hyksos. The Ashurians, the Babylonians, and other Iraqi empires conquered Palestine. The Persians conquered Palestine. The Europeans also wanted to have their share. So the Romans, the Greeks before them, conquered Palestine. And again, some of the Palestinian communities were lucky at certain points of time, and they also conquered their neighboring regions. But these different small entities or these empires ceased to control Palestine when eventually one single political administration came in the form of the Islamic conquest of Palestine. In the 7th century AD, at about 638, the Islamic Caliph, Umar ibn Khattab, the second Caliph of the Islamic Empire, he came himself to actually receive the keys of the gates of the ancient city of Jerusalem from the Patriarch of Jerusalem. In Arabic, we call him Sophronius. I don't know what's the English name. Unlike all of the other conquests of the Islamic Empire, like Egypt, Persia, Iraq, the rest of Arabia, it was Islamic armies or Islamic missionaries that actually either conquered the land or invited the people to convert to Islam. In the case of Palestine, this historical place, and the case of Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, this holy place for the monotheistic religions, it was the Caliph himself that actually came all the way to receive the keys of Jerusalem and entered the city of Jerusalem in a peaceful takeover. So there was no bloodshed in Jerusalem during the first Islamic conquest of Jerusalem in 638. And both communities, the Muslim community, which has come with the Islamic conquest, and the original Christian inhabitants, who are Canaanite descendants of Palestine, coexisted. But interestingly, Umar ibn Khattab and the Islamic conquest allowed or offered also the Jewish community to settle in Palestine. We know that a few hundred years earlier, the Romans had a lot of military clashes with the Jewish communities who were descendants of one of the many Canaanite communities. The Romans banned them from entering Jerusalem, and Umar ibn Khattab, after the Islamic conquest, allowed them back into the city of Jerusalem. And there's a very interesting document called the Covenant of Umar, Al-Uhdat al-Umariyya, which is still preserved until today, that clearly states that this city is for all people of all faiths. They are welcome to live and coexist in peace. Ever since the Islamic conquest of Palestine happened in the 7th century, the land continued to be run by different Islamic dynasties, except for a short interruption during the Crusades. So the first Islamic empire, the Rashidun, which continued for some 30 years, ruled Palestine. Then the Umayyad empire, which ruled for up to about 100 years from Damascus. Damascus was the capital of the empire, ruled Palestine. And many of the beautiful architecture that you see today in Palestine was actually built during the Umayyad period. So the Dome of the Rock with the beautiful golden dome was built during this period, the Second Islamic Empire, which was run from Damascus. The Qibli Mosque, the different historical palaces that you see in Jericho, Jerusalem, and elsewhere were built during this period. Of course, there were some Roman, artifacts and structures. Interestingly, some of the Islamic structures were actually built on the remnants of Roman Byzantine structures. Eventually, the Abbasids took over. After 100 years of the Umayyad rule, they run their capital in Baghdad. So the Islamic empire back then expanded to a huge expansion. And Palestine continued to be one of the main districts of the new Islamic empire. The Canaanites, who later became or started to be called the Philistines or the Palestinians, continued to exist. But by this age, they were Muslim, Christian, and Jewish. So we had the Canaanite people either maintaining their Jewish faith or Christian faith or converting to Islam. And that's why Palestine and the Levant is one of the very few regions in the world where you have religious communities that continue to preserve their faith for hundreds, probably thousands of years. You don't see ancient Islamic communities in Andalusia, in Spain. I don't think you can. I bet you can try research. You don't see a single, old Muslim community or Arab community in Andalusia, in Spain or Portugal, because they were purged some 600 years ago when the Inquisitions happened and the Spaniards took over. You will interestingly see Christian communities and Jewish communities in Palestine that continue to exist for 2,000 or more years. The same in Syria and in Jordan. This in spite of the stereotypes that you see now in some mainstream international media about the persecution of these ancient communities in the Levant and in the Middle East. Anyway, the Abbasids continued for hundreds of years. There were different political dynasties during the Abbasid time. The Turkic Seljuks were amongst them, the Fatimids earlier. Later on, the Mamlukid kingdom, which ruled from Cairo, also controlled Palestine. And around this period, there was an attempt to conquer Palestine by the Mongols, who came all the way, the troops of Genghis Khan came all the way to West Asia, but they were defeated by the Egyptian Mamluk Empire in Palestine, interestingly. So one of the most major battles of ancient history happened in Palestine, in Ain Jalut, when the Egyptian armies defeated the Mongol armies. Had this battle not happened and had the Mamluks lost that war, the Mongols could have probably continued to North Africa and the rest of Africa. The Crusades also tried their luck, and some European missionaries came together under the leadership of Pope Urban some 1,000 years ago, all the way from Europe, especially France, some even from the British Isles. They came all the way, marched to Constantinople, which was run by the Byzantine Empire, and continued all their way to Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and eventually managed to conquer Palestine and conquer the city of Jerusalem and establish the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was a European Christian kingdom in the heartland of Palestine, continued for about 190 years. But for probably half of this period, it was not controlling Jerusalem. It was called the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but it was in the coastal areas of Palestine. Except for this 100 or 190 years of European rule of Palestine, the land continued to be run by the Muslim dynasties from the 7th century all the way until the coming of the colonial era. Now, in 1517, the Ottoman Empire, which was a young, vigorous empire based in Turkey and run from Constantinople or Istanbul, they defeated the Egyptian Mamluks and took over control of Palestine. And the city of Jerusalem became a central administrative region under the Ottoman Empire for centuries. The rule of Palestine throughout the 400 years that followed continued to be managed from Constantinople. And eventually in 1917, this long rule came to an end and the British era started. We will pause here for a while and go back to a problem that was happening in Europe. Until 1917, the Muslims, Christians, and Jews who lived in Jerusalem and in Palestine coexisted. Of course, there is an impossible 100% harmonious relationship anywhere in the world. Even in Malaysia or in Indonesia, when you look into your modern history, there were some ups and downs. But in the case of Palestine, for most of the history, there was a relative peace and harmony and coexistence between the Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities which lived in this ancient land, except for the period of the Crusades, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, because unfortunately the Crusades decided to wipe out other followers of other faiths. So there was a huge massacre in the end of the 11th century in Jerusalem itself. Records say that thousands, probably tens of thousands, were massacred in Jerusalem, Muslim and Jewish. The Crusades took over rule, and interestingly, some Christian denominations which did not follow the church in Rome were also massacred during this period. But apart from this temporary period, there was peace and harmony amongst the different faiths. Now let's go to Europe. Let's zoom out from the Middle East and look into Europe, Western and Eastern Europe. There were several Jewish communities living in Europe in different forms. Some in ghetto, separate communities. Some merged with the other populations and lived in urban centers and in cities. Some were relatively welcome, but some were not welcome and were persecuted. Where did these Jewish communities originate from, or where did they come from? This is subject to a lot of historical debate. But some of the theories suggest that they are Khazar Jews who came from areas near, for instance, the Caspian Sea, or from areas in Eastern Europe. They embraced the Jewish faith at one point of time. Some probably originated from Palestine because there were an Israelite community. They moved to Andalusia or to Spain and Portugal. Some relocated and settled in Western Europe or Eastern Europe. So their ethnic background is up to debate. But many of them believed in the Jewish faith and were culturally Jewish. And to say that they are one Jewish community is also problematic because many of them had their own different cultures. They spoke in certain areas Yiddish, like around Germany or Poland. They spoke English in some other regions, French and other languages, or Russian. But yeah, there was this very fine thread that united them. They are Jewish in faith, just like Muslims. I speak Arabic at home, but some Muslim Malaysians speak Malay at home. Some Muslim Americans speak English at home. there is this fine thread. We are all Muslims. We worship the same God. But there are major differences in our linguistic, in our cultural identity, in our political identity, and so on. So these different Jewish communities in Europe faced some persecution. The situation of the Jewish communities in North Africa and the Arab world was very, very different. In Egypt, for instance, some of the Jewish scholars made it to the position of ministers. Some of them were amongst the senior advisors of the kings, caliphs, and sultans. In Andalusia, the Jewish communities in Andalusia, in Spain and Portugal, before, of course, the expulsion of the Muslim and Arab community from Spain, some of them were amongst the most influential philosophers. People like Musa bin Maimun, a very senior Jewish philosopher, was very well respected within the different Muslim communities in North Africa and Andalusia. In the Levant, in Palestine, Syria, Jordan, of course, today's Syria, today's Jordan, today's Palestine. In Iraq, some of these Jewish communities were amongst the most successful business communities or political, communities and intellectual figures. But in Europe, it was a different history. Unfortunately, of course, for them, and eventually, unfortunately, for us in Palestine. Mm-hmm. The Jewish communities in Europe faced some persecution, prejudice, and anti-Semitism emerged in Europe. So if you read The Merchant of Venice, the novel, you will find that the way they talk about the Jewish community wasn't very friendly. In Russia, towards the late 19th century and early 20th century, the Jewish communities in Russia faced persecution, and something called the Jewish pogrom happened. They were actually massacred. They were forced out of their land. Probably during the Soviet era later, many other communities were persecuted as well. But they faced difficulties in many parts of Eastern Europe. They also faced difficulties in some parts of Western Europe. And although it was not always visible, but some sort of discrimination existed. And this discrimination actually inspired some Jewish communities, including someone by the name of Theodor Herzl, to think of a solution. So the European communities in Europe, who were facing discrimination, started to think of solutions. We know that Europe in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century was going through the phase of nationalism. Nationalism is probably a new phenomenon. So it started in the early 19th century in Latin America. Many Latin Americans started to identify as Bolivian, identify as Argentine, identify as Brazilian. Eventually, they got their independence. Later on, it happened in Europe. The Polish started to identify as Polish, the French as French, the Italians as Italians. Although a few hundred years earlier, they were all run under monarchies, under empires. The distinction between the different nationalist groups wasn't there. It was very blurry. So you will have probably an Austrian king running French subjects. And they were both okay because the police or the army was probably Italian. But things around this period started to have their, toll on the Jewish communities in Europe, who were different in religion. The majority of the European communities were Christian. The Jewish were Jewish. They had different, sometimes economic functions in the society. Some of them were living in separate ghettos. Some of them were doing certain jobs that the Europeans were not doing. So this kind of discrimination started to happen. And if you try to reflect on other countries here in Asia or elsewhere, you will actually get what I mean. The Jewish communities in Europe started to be persecuted. Eventually, when nationalism started to go vigorous, there were a lot of civil wars, a lot of bloodshed. And a lot of people started to say that this land belongs to me. And I'm Greek. I'm not Ottoman. So the Greeks quit. I am Serbian. I am Slavic. I am Polish. I am this and that. So the Jewish people in Europe started to also think about it. What are we? They had this question. Some of them decided to completely merge with the larger community. And they said that Jewish emancipation should be in the form of merger with the other larger communities. So many of them started saying, no, we are German. It doesn't matter what my faith is. Some said we are French. Some said we are British. But many others said, or not many probably at the early stage, some others said, no, we are Jewish. We share a common cultural identity. Some of them, of course, trace their roots back to Palestine, but many cannot actually make such claim because of their ethnic, European ethnic background. Their faith is Jewish, but they probably cannot draw a link with the ancient Israelites. Anyway, around this period, there was something called the Jewish problem. Okay, let's try to be brief in this ancient history. The Jewish problem, it emerged in Europe. The Jewish political problem emerged in Europe. Many Jewish communities started to, or intellectuals started to think about emancipation, Jewish nationalism. They started to say the solution is to leave this land and find another place to organize politically. One of the senior Jewish activists of the era was Theodor Herzl. He and many others of his friends were members of things called the Lovers of Zion, some kind of NGOs around that period. They started to have discussions, to write about creating a Jewish state, a state for the Jewish people. So Theodor Herzl wrote a book in the name of the Judenstaat, or the Jewish state, in which he suggested that we should have a state of our own somewhere. For Herzl, around the late 19th century, it wasn't very clear where this state should be. But Palestine was one of the options. And the Zionist movement started to have serious discussion, where to have the Jewish state. They held their first World Zionist Organization conference in Switzerland in 1897. And they had a serious discussion. They created an official NGO or an official political group, and they started to discuss where should we have our state. Some of them suggested Argentina, because it was one of the colonial settlements, and there were some Jewish communities there. Some suggested Uganda, because it was under the British Empire. Some suggested Palestine and said, look, we have more historical claims here. Why should we go very far? And in the case of Russia, Russia was thinking of a solution to get rid of many of the European communities in Russia, and they created a regime or a district called Birobidzhan, somewhere under the Russian Empire. But eventually, the Zionist movement started to think strategically, and they said we have to lobby the superpowers. Which were the superpowers of the time? The British, of course, the French, the Russian, and the Ottoman. So 120, 130 years ago, they started to reach out. Theodor Herzl himself paid a visit and met with representatives of the German Empire. He met with representatives of the British Empire, and he interestingly sought a meeting with the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul. But the Sultan sent his prime minister, Sadr al-Azam, to meet him. And he made an open offer. He said, we are willing to settle the debts of the sick man of Europe, which was the Ottoman Empire. They used to be called the sick man of Europe because it was a very ancient empire and was at the brink of collapse. We are willing to pay your debts, but give us a homeland in Palestine or around Jerusalem. Sultan Abdul Hamid, the Sultan of that time, found it ridiculous. He said, oh, I need the money, of course, but I'm not going to give up a part of my territory because I don't own it. And his answer was, this is owned by all of my subjects, the 20 or 30 million subjects of the Ottoman Empire. So Herzl felt disappointed, and he started to reach out to other empires. Herzl did not live to see the Jewish state emerge. He died, I think, in 1904. And eventually his followers, people like Chaim Weizmann and others, started to organize politically and hold their conference once a year and to reach out to empires. The golden opportunity emerged in the First World War. Unfortunately for us in Palestine, we were amongst the Ottoman territories that were cut off and handed over to one of the colonial powers. In 1914, the First World War started. The British, the superpower of the time, started to plot with everybody. Interestingly, because I think now some other superpowers do the same. So they started to talk to the Jewish Zionist movement, and they started to talk to the Arab king, Sharif Hussein of Mecca. And they started to talk to the Russians, to the French, and others. So they promised Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the governor of Mecca, the Hashemite governor of Mecca, if you rebel against the Ottoman Empire, we will give you an Arabic or an Arab kingdom in Arabia. The whole Arabian Peninsula, including Palestine, of course, will become the new caliphate, the new kingdom for the Arabs. He started his revolution. And he and, of course, his supporters call it the Great Arab Revolution of 1916, I think. The Jewish Zionist movement, which wasn't very popular amongst the Jews up until then, was promised a homeland in Palestine if they cooperate with the British Empire during the First World War. So something called the Balfour Declaration in 1917 was issued by the government of the British kingdom to the Zionist movement in Europe. And the letter was sent to Rothschild, one of the wealthy, influential Zionist figures of Britain in 1917. But at the same time, the British were plotting also with the French. And in 1916, they had a very important treatment called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It was signed by a British and a French diplomat, Mark Sykes and Picot, a French guy. They drew the map that you see now in the Middle East. You Google West Asia. The map that you see, the lines between Jordan and Iraq, the lines between Syria and Iraq were drawn by these two guys some 100 years ago in a small room like this, where they decided that there should be a nation called Jordan, run by whoever they decide. And it wasn't actually assigned to the Jordanians. It was assigned to the Hashemites who came from Mecca. There should be a nation called Syria. There should be a nation called Iraq. And they brought the Kurdish people here, and they brought southern Iraqis, and they created a new construct. There were ancient people, of course, but they all were subjects of the Ottoman Empire. They drew the map together with the French. Later, in the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, many of these declassified documents were exposed, and the people of the region realized that they were being fooled. The British were talking to everybody. By the end of the First World War, the British won the war and took over many territories in the Middle East. They took over Palestine, Jordan, Iraq. Of course, they had control over Egypt, many Gulf territories, and they were probably the biggest winners of the First World War. Unfortunately for us in Palestine, every other territory was promised an autonomous administration or independence by the British, except us. Our land, the Palestinians, was promised to someone else. They decided to hand over or to create a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. We had no problem with the Jewish people because there were Jewish people in Palestine. And in the beginning, we had no problem with some of the migrant Jewish communities which came to Palestine because they were persecuted in Europe. Just like any other respectable nation will welcome some of the refugees during time of crisis. But when the British took over Palestine in 1917, and eventually officially controlled Palestine in 1922, they set in motion the fastest and most heinous robbery of the 20th century. They plotted with the Zionist movement, a political movement in Europe, to replace the Palestinian people with another migrant community that had a political agenda to convert the land of Palestine from a land for all to a land only for the Zionist Jewish community. And unfortunately, this worked to some extent. From 1922 all the way until 1947, the original Jewish population in Palestine was in the few thousands, Jewish Palestinians who spoke Arabic. By 1947, 30% of the population of historical Palestine was Zionist migrant community, which was well-armed, well-equipped, well-trained. They participated in the First World War with the British. They participated in the Second World War with the British. They had their plans. The first High Commissioner appointed by the British to Palestine was a Zionist British in the name of Herbert Samuel. The Palestinians who protested so many times were denied any political organization. We were not allowed an elected parliament. We were not allowed to have our own political establishment. Our people, of course, the Palestinians actually are very literate, very, very educated. They love education. So we had probably some of the earliest PhD holders in the whole Middle East in the early 20th century. We formed our political parties in the 1920s. Many of our Arab neighbors and even Zionist communities did not have political parties back then, but we had so many political parties in the 1920s. But we realized that we are negotiating with a very powerful side that doesn't care about our political demands. Our people, including the governor of Jerusalem, Musa Kadhim al-Husseini, protested and were repressed, and he was killed in a protest, in a civilian unarmed protest in the city of Jerusalem. And our demands were dismissed. So in 30 years, the Jewish Zionist state was created under the supervision of the British. They created the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. They created the Jewish Agency. They created the Jewish National Fund. They created the Palmach, the Haganah, the military forces. And in 1947, they only waited for some spark to take over the land. They were ready, actually. Because it's not about how many people you have. It's about how many people ready under arm you have. 1947, the United Nations was deliberating, the newly established United Nations was deliberating about what to do with the colonial territories. So in the case of the British, they were tired of Palestine already because they didn't know how to manage it. They were, every few years, Palestinians were revolting. The Zionist movement sometimes was clashing with them. Eventually they said, that's it. We don't want to deal with it. Send it to the United Nations. The United Nations, with the influence of many Western European countries and the US, decided to partition Palestine. And some said this is actually a logical solution. It is logical if you know nothing about the situation. It's like I come today and decide that I'm going to partition Malaysia. I will give maybe I'll pick Sarawak or Sabah to be handed over to one of the refugee communities in a neighboring country because I'm going to solve their problem. And original inhabitants of Sabah, you have to leave. Send somebody else. It makes no sense. It solves your problem because you don't want to find practical solutions. But anyway, partition was the solution that the United Nations decided. And it was the green light that the Zionist forces in Palestine received to take over Palestine. From November 1947 all the way until the end of 1949, the Zionist movement stormed into Palestinian towns. They had, by the end of this war, up to 120,000 well-trained, well-armed soldiers who managed to steal some 80% of Palestine. The partition plan of the United Nations gave the supposed Jewish state 55% of Palestine, and the supposed Palestinian state 45% of Palestine. Although, interestingly, up to that point in 1947, the Palestinian Arabs, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, owned more than 90% of the land. But the United Nations decided that it's okay, give this Zionist movement for 55% of Palestine. The Zionist movement did not practically accept the partition plan. They rhetorically accepted the partition plan, but their forces on the ground controlled 80% of Palestine. It was only because of the fierce resistance in the West Bank and Gaza that the Israeli state did not control everything from day one. In 1948, they declared the establishment of the State of Israel. And eventually, a new state emerged, a new political construct emerged in the region. The Palestinians had to be forced out. Some 750,000 Palestinians became refugees. The Israeli narrative is that they were asked by the Arab governments to leave until the Arabs kick the Zionists out of Palestine. But of course, that's ridiculous. When you come with armed with guns and fighter jets and everything, and you tell a community go out, they just go out. But the Palestinians, 76 years later, learned the lesson. Israel is repeating the same thing in Gaza today, the same ethnic cleansing, but the Palestinians are not leaving. Because if you leave, you never come back. 1948, up to a million Palestinians were forced out. Up to 500 Palestinian towns and cities were demolished and destroyed by the Zionist movement. And this is not documented only by Palestinians. This is documented by Israeli historians, people like Professor Ilan Pape, who has written a very exceptional work in the name of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Please read it. It's a must read. The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Israeli historian Ilan Pape. He documents how there was a plan by the Israeli militias to do ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is not necessarily genocide where you kill everybody. Ethnic cleansing is where you kill and kick out people. So they offered humanitarian, so-called humanitarian corridors. The same terminology was repeated in Gaza and in Lebanon. And they started to drive hundreds of thousands of people out of these towns. And they started, once they established the state, they started to convert the names. So Al-Quds turns into the biblical ancient name of Jerusalem, or in Hebrew, Orshalim. My city, Al-Khalil, turns into Hebron, the ancient biblical name. So they started to convert, transform the identity of the land. But some Palestinians remained. And they became like a thorn in the, back of the Zionist state. These are the Israeli Palestinian Arabs, 1.5 million of them. Now, back then, they were a few hundred thousands. Israel tried to transform their identity by all means possible. They set them under military rule for almost 2 decades. Then they eventually banned them from political organization. Eventually, they allowed them into the parliament, but they stripped them of many of their rights. In 2018, Israel passed the nation state law, an apartheid-like law in which the Arabic language is degraded. The Palestinian flag is not allowed to be flown anywhere inside historical Palestine. And these people are second-class citizens in Israel. But what about the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, the small territories that Israel couldn't take in 1947, 1948? Jordan annexed West Bank, Egypt annexed Gaza. And the Palestinians there started to plan how to restore their homeland because many of the refugees ended up in the West Bank and Gaza. Unfortunately, in 1967, the Israeli state, the new political regime that emerged in historical Palestine, wasn't satisfied with the 80% of historical Palestine. They wanted expansion. And this goes back to the settler colonial ideology of Zionism. Zionism, in simple words, is to believe that the Jewish people have rights over historical Palestine. What kind of rights? Zionism, of course, is many colors. There is an ultra-nationalist Zionist or an ultra-religious Zionist who believes that the Jewish people should have political right over the land from the Nile to the Euphrates. A minister like Bezalel Smotrich, he's the finance minister. It's a serious matter, it's a senior minister. The finance minister of Israel now believes on TV. He goes on TV to talk about historical Israel or greater Israel, where Israel controls from the Euphrates in Iraq all the way until the Nile in Egypt. This will include territories from Egypt, Palestine, of course, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. He and many other ministers and members of the Israeli Knesset are not even shy to talk about this in public on TV. Someone like Netanyahu believes in, he's more pragmatic. So he wants a greater Israel, but not necessarily with full political rule over this territory. Because at the end of the day, he thinks Israelis are a few million. How can you control this huge territory? So he talks about political dominance, economic dominance. So you steal some territories from Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, but you control the Iraqis through other means. Anyway, 1967, they expanded. 1982, they invaded Lebanon, expanded further. And every time they invade a new land, they start to look into their books and find biblical explanation for everything. If we are to do that, we can find justification for anything. Religious scriptures can justify anything and nothing. Because some extremist Muslim groups like ISIS can pick up the Quran, pick and choose a verse and misinterpret it and say, this gives us full right to actually kill everybody. But another Muslim will tell them, no, that doesn't give you a right to kill everybody. Doesn't give you a right to establish a state. Doesn't give you a right to do this and that. The same applies to the Christian scriptures. The same applies to the Jewish scriptures. The same applies to the Hindu scriptures. So to justify Israel's control over Palestine and the region by biblical scriptures is just ridiculous. But unfortunately, many people in today's world do so, especially in Western countries. In the US, we have now a president-elect, who actually has no issue whatsoever in Israel's expansion. So all the way until today, 2024. This new Zionist state, new because I'm from a region in which cities existed for 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years. So when I say 50 years, 100 years, this is new. Honestly, I face this problem when I talk to friends and friends in Malaysia. For instance, I say, we go to a museum and I see something that is 200 or 300 years old. So I start to say, this is new. And they say, no, what are you talking about? I grew up in a town where there are buildings that are 5,000 years old, 4,000 years old. So this is how I measure history. Maybe I'm wrong. The Israeli Zionist state, which emerged in 1948, did not accept to live in peace with its neighbors. They had many golden opportunities. Yes, you managed to steal something. You could have normalized and lived in peace, but they continue to choose to expand. Expansionist ideology is a problem. So settler colonial Zionist ideology is a problem because it's a colonial, settler colonial ideology. But expansionism is yet another problem. Domination, subjugation of others is also another problem. They see us as inferiors. You look at the interviews of the former Israeli defense minister, Gallant, when he talked about Gaza. He said, we are fighting human animals. The same terminology that George Bush used when they invaded Iraq. We are the dark, the children of the dark, according to Netanyahu. And he and his gang are the children of the light. This kind of discriminatory ideology is a problem. The problem in Palestine, and I conclude with this idea, the real root cause of the problem is the extremist, settler, colonial, expansionist ideology of Zionism. Had Israel decided to live in peace, they would have abandoned Zionism long ago. Just like Germany abandoned Nazism and now lives in peace with its neighbors. Just like Italy abandoned fascism. But unfortunately, we live in an era where neo-Nazi, neo-fascist ideology is rearing its head again. We are talking about an era where some people don't mind killing others because they think they are more, they are superior and they deserve to live, they deserve to control. Others don't deserve to even exist. In the last 1 year, Israel decided to finish off the unfinished business of 1947, 1948. The Palestinians, who have been subject to all sorts of atrocities, illegal detention, persecution, tried to knock out the Israeli occupation. But of course, they didn't work. What happened is that Israel took it as a golden opportunity to finish an unfinished business and to actually implement genocide. They tried ethnic cleansing first, to be fair to them, but they didn't fail. It didn't work. So they opted to genocide. In October 2023, the Palestinians tried to fight the Israeli army for a few hours. It worked. The Israeli Central Command surrounding Gaza, some 15,000 soldiers who were well equipped, well trained, lost the military encounter. And within a few hours, 11 military sites were completely shattered. But since then, the right-wing Israeli government decided to teach the Palestinians a lesson that not the Palestinians will learn forever, the region will learn forever, because the plan for the Palestinians was to finish them off. They tried ethnic cleansing from October 8th all the way until today. They have been bombing the Palestinians and promising humanitarian corridors. What were these humanitarian corridors designed for? They were designed for ethnic cleansing, actually, because they wanted as much land with as less people as possible. But the Palestinians were stubborn and they said, no, we're not leaving. We tried that in 1947. Look where we ended up. We don't want to leave. Now, half of our population are refugees. 7 million Palestinians are still refugees since 1948. The other half lives under occupation. So people of Gaza refused to leave. Some of them relocated, internally displaced in Gaza. Almost more than 1 million were displaced from North Gaza all the way to the south because they were told this is the safe zone, quote unquote. But when the Palestinians did not leave in mass numbers from the Gaza Strip, Israel's phase 2 plan or second plan was kill as many as you can. And this is the carpet bombing that you see in Gaza. To explain what's happening in Gaza, we are in this room, 20 people, 30 people, and Israel thinks one of us is a terrorist. Maybe not me. One of us is considered by the Israeli military a terrorist. They have no qualms. They have no problem whatsoever to drop a big bomb and kill all of you. This happened on a daily basis since October 8th. And it continues to happen as we speak. If you check the news, at least 30 or 40 people were killed yesterday in Gaza. And another 40 or 50 will be killed today by Israel, because their morally questionable ideology justifies all of this. They justify bombing hospitals, bombing schools, bombing universities, destroying our infrastructure, dismantling our existence, because they believe they are better. So they have to steal more land. If Israel succeeds in Gaza, trust me, they will go into Syria. They are actually considering going to Syria today. If you check Israeli media, they are publicly talking about securing themselves by creating a buffer zone in Syria. If Israel succeeds in Gaza, they will go into Lebanon again. They failed, of course, in Lebanon. They tried very hard in the last 2 months, but they faced tough resistance. So the last standing, shield that the whole region has against Zionism is actually the few resistance fighters we have in Lebanon, in Gaza, in the West Bank. Not that I am a fan of violence, but when the occupation is a very brutal, violent regime that does not believe you deserve the right to exist. Even animals have a right to exist, but for them, we are human animals, we don't deserve existence. When the occupation is of this nature, what is there to stop them? The ICC, the ICJ, the US? The only way to stop them actually is for the whole world to come together and block this regime from continuing its atrocities through economic boycott, through cultural boycott, through more awareness, through more solidarity efforts, through political lobbying, through isolating this regime, through the initiative that the Malaysian Prime Minister was talking about, expelling Israel from the United Nations. And of course, Israel has no respect whatsoever for the United Nations. Google the interview with the former Israeli envoy to the United Nations. The host was asking him, what do you think is the best? How do you feel when you see the United Nations building? His answer was something along the line of like, it shouldn't exist, or it should be flat, something like that. This is how they think about the United Nations, which gave them the justification to create their own regime. So to conclude, our problem is not the Jewish people. Our problem is not a political crisis. Our problem is not lack of food. Our problem is settler colonial expansion and occupation. This political regime created by the Zionist movement has caused a lot of disaster and bloodshed. The best way out is to force this regime to change its policies, to accept that Palestinians are humans who deserve to live in peace and dignity. This is the only way to restore peace and coexistence. Otherwise, this bloodshed will continue. And the regime that occupies Palestine now will most probably expand and occupy other territories. I see that happening in Syria very soon, unfortunately. I don't know how you see the situation in Syria, but I read Israeli media, and they are really considering invading Syria, at least parts of southern Syria. If they face no opposition, they will go all the way to Damascus. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and sorry for taking a long time.
Thank you very much, Muslim. Thank you very much. I think that there's been a great deal of explanation you have offered us. Thank you. It probably requires another round of listening to the recorded version. Plenty to digest, but I can say from the little that I know that it is all relevant in the sense that they form the fragments, the puzzles that fill up the picture for people to understand what's going on. This is obviously the time for us to ask questions and to jump in with comments. We have another half an hour or so. If there's someone with a question straight away, I'll go to that right away. If not, I will get the ball rolling with a question. And I don't see a question online yet either at the moment. So at the moment, there is a hand up. Okay, we have a question from the floor.
I'm just wondering how much in Israeli involvement in the attacks in Syria right now? I'm just wondering.
Okay, should I answer now? Okay, Israel has this superiority complex. So, of course, they are the descendants of a colonial, era. So they think that the best way to stay safe is through the iron wall, a theory that was proposed by a founding Israeli thinker by the name of Ze'ev Jabotinsky, saying that, in simple words, that Israel has to be so powerful, so strong, that it constructs a virtual iron wall to protect itself from its neighbors, so that its neighbors cannot even think about attacking it. Of course, this failed in 1973 and failed again in 2023. But this idea, which is very accepted by the Israeli military establishment, means that if your enemy might be a threat, kill him first. There is a book about the Israeli Mossad, the Israeli foreign intelligence body. And I think the title of the book is Stand and Kill First, something like that. This maxim, this idea is actually well enshrined in the Zionist ideology. You are justified to kill your enemy if you think he or she might pose a threat, not necessarily today, after 5 years or 10 years. Remember the pager massacre? When they pressed the button and killed tens, injured hundreds, or probably thousands in Lebanon? That was, of course, a war crime. They have been planning it for so many years. What entitles you to actually do such a thing is this ideology. This idea that you are better than others, so you have the right to kill first if the enemy thinks, if the enemy is a threat. So Malaysia now feels maybe there are security threats somewhere around in the South China Sea or in the, Pacific Ocean or somewhere, or in the Atlantic Ocean. And you start to dispatch your commandos to shoot and kill people because you feel threatened. Is that justified? No one in their right mind accepts this kind of ideology. But in Israel, it's actually very, very well accepted. Because they talk publicly on TV about transfer. The term transfer is one of the most common words in Israeli media. Transferring the Palestinians after the West Bank, before even Gaza. This has been there for 20 or 30 years. So they don't mind also killing first. They see what's happening in Syria as a threat. They see the Iraqi, or they saw the Iraqi nuclear power plant in 1982 as a threat. They bombed it. They see the Iranian nuclear nuclear facilities as a threat. So they have been killing nuclear scientists for the last 20 years. They killed so many of them. They see Egyptian nuclear, aspirations, even if it is for peaceful purposes, as a threat. They kill. After the 2003 American invasion of Iraq, the Israeli intelligence apparatus engaged in mass killing of Iraqi scholars and scientists. And the idea was these scientists, be it chemical scientists, rocket scientists, whatever scientists, might become a threat. Get rid of them. Because they cannot, of course, coerce or persuade an Iraqi scientist to come and work for them. So the solution is cleanse. This is now the thinking in Syria. They look at southern Syria. They see a lot of rebel groups. They look at an ailing administration in Damascus. They see military clashes and they feel threatened. So the solution for them is not to talk to everybody, which anyone in the right mind will suggest. The solution is strike. So for the last 1 year, they have bombed Syria more than probably they have bombed Yemen. Like Yemen is one of their enemies. They bombed Syria more. They, in the last 10 years, since the start of the Syrian civil war, they have been doing precision strikes on a regular basis. There is not a single week that passes without a strike on Syria. But in the last few weeks, the strikes on Syria were almost on daily basis. The drones fly all over Syria regularly, maybe 24/7. But the strikes to kill Syrians, be it from the regime or from the opposition, doesn't matter to them, happen on regular basis. Only yesterday, they bombed, I think in Aleppo, somewhere in the north of Syria, some military facilities because they had the idea that if these rebel groups get access to some of the strategic weapons, they might in the future think about using them. So kill and destroy. So Israel has been attacking. There's a pattern. The same applies to Lebanon. The same applies in the case of regimes that endorse Israel or recognize Israel and do security coordination with Israel, like Jordan, they don't strike because they can talk to the administration, stop this and stop that. But in case of any regime that they have no direct relations with, their option is always kill first. That's what's happening.
Thank you, Muslim. We're starting to get questions online, and can I ask the floor to think about the next question while I jump in with one of my own first before I get into one of the online questions. And this question has to do with the arena of public opinion. I want to bring it back to what people can do in civil society. And as far as that is concerned, obviously it's a battle, a struggle for the way we see things, opinions, and essentially public opinion. And it's so important because where that public opinion sits is also where Israel can act with impunity. So say, for example, from the very early days, the myth of Palestine being a land without people, for a people without a land. And that myth was propagated to the extent that even Zionist settlers from Europe, when they arrived at Palestine, they were surprised to find people. And the Zionists' own initial excursions to go check out the land before we send people over, one of them came back with the remark that the bride is beautiful, but is married to another man. That fact means that they themselves actually knew there were already people, and yet the myth of the land without people continues to this day. So someone holds a control of the narrative, which has a hold over the public mind. My question, therefore, is if public opinion is important, and it is important because that is where pressure comes upon governments and how they act or do not act with regards to the Zionist entity of Israel. Do you see a change? Do you see hope in potentially changing public opinion that could help the Palestinian cause?
Okay, thank you very much. You have actually touched on several important points. First of all, Palestine was not lost in an intellectual debate. It wasn't that there was a Zionist camp and a Palestinian camp. They debated and the audience felt that the Zionists deserve the land more and then they should get it. They won because of military force, brutal military force, colonization, colonial policies, and eventually the ethnic cleansing that took place. That's why whenever we start doing some readings, we realize that many of the myths that Israel and the Zionist movement have used are ridiculous. But unfortunately, many, especially in the West, believe them. Well, until recently. It's good to check some of the books that actually argue against the Zionist myths and the Zionist narrative, including books of Professor Norman Finkelstein, an American Jewish professor, who has written beautifully about, and in a very well-respected academic manner, about Israel's and the Zionist movement's narrative. He has a book called Beyond the Chutzpah, in which he destroys their arguments about Palestine being a land without people for a people without land. But many, of course, especially the layman, don't want to read and don't want to bother about what's happening. Now there are short videos that explain things better. But so this is the first thing. It's really necessary to know that if there is an open, fair debate, their logic is just embarrassing. The second point is about what you asked just now, the public opinion. If public opinion isn't important, Israel and the US and many other powers wouldn't spend billions of dollars in shaping it. Israel has now a ministry called Ministry of Strategic Affairs, something along this line, to counter the efforts of BDS, the Boycott, Divest, Sanctions movement. The Israeli, Hasbara and propaganda machine invests billions of dollars, not millions of dollars, in shaping the views of the world and in shaping public opinion. So it is important. They believe it's important. And I think also it's important. This is how to create momentum for a struggle. we have been fighting for our freedom and independence for 100 years or more, but we haven't got it yet. Why? Is it because the Palestinians didn't fight enough? We sacrificed so much. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of victims. At least 1 million Palestinians were jailed by Israel since 1967. At least 1 million. There is not a single Palestinian family that did not have someone being taken to jail, sometimes under administrative detention, which is a very ridiculous administrative law where you are jailed without charges because they have some secret files accusing you of so and so. At least 20,000 Palestinians were killed before the genocide started in Gaza, only in the last 20 years. Children maimed. In 2018 to 2020, in 2 years, in the Great Return March, which was a very peaceful protest at the border of Gaza, 18,000 Palestinians were injured, lost a limb or lost an eye because of the Israeli brutal repression of their peaceful protests. So the sacrifices have been huge. But none of these sacrifices resulted in us getting a free Palestine. What will help us is an additional effort from the world. We say in Arabic, one hand does not clap. You need actually two hands to clap. The South African indigenous people struggled against colonialism and later apartheid for so many decades. But it was only when the whole world stood with them that they got their rights. When the whole world started to boycott apartheid South Africa, when the Eastern and Western world started to abandon this apartheid regime, to cut its economic ties with this apartheid regime, to stop even cultural interactions, sports interactions. Only when this happened, plus the strong, fierce resistance on the ground from the African communities, only when all of this happened, the apartheid regime collapsed. They, when they lost all their dominance and power, they came to their senses and they started to think about solutions. Israel now is too powerful. They don't think that they should give concessions. But trust me, in the last few years, the momentum has grown so fast. Public opinion around the world started to make a difference. So when the efforts to bring Israeli leaders to justice in the ICC bore fruit, in the last few days, public opinion people started to open their eyes. Many, especially those who did not bother to ask about what's happening, when they saw that, Netanyahu is being charged in the ICC, they started to think about it. Why is he being charged in the ICC? When the case in the ICJ went through and now it's being deliberated upon, and eventually I think they will rule that Israel is committing genocide, many people started to open their eyes. So public opinion needs all these sparks to change. And it doesn't change over the course of 1, 2 days, 1 year, 2 years. It takes sometimes decades. Slavery was there for thousands of years, and it took hundreds of years of efforts to actually end it. The rights of the Black movement in the United States continued for tens of years until they eventually got some of the rights, and they still demands certain rights. So in Palestine, many until 20 years ago, many, especially in the US and in some of the superpowers, the Western superpowers, many thought that we are the wrong side. Many thought that Palestinians came from somewhere and stole the land of the Jewish people. Many thought that these are terrorist, Islamist, barbarian killers coming to destroy the Western civilization. Many believed in this nonsense. Only now, when they started to do more reading, because when the news when the situation is all over the news every day, sometimes you feel you have to go out of your comfort zone. If it was not on the news every day, they wouldn't. With TikTok and social media, of course, more people started to see things. The things that happened in Gaza now happened in 1947, 1948, but we didn't have TikTok or Instagram, in spite of the censorship, of course. We didn't have any of that, of these apparatuses for us to see what is happening. Now public opinion is shifting. There were 500,000 people protesting in Washington against the genocide in Gaza. Maybe 1 million in London, tens of thousands across the world. This emotional impulse will not end the war, I'm sure, but it is building the momentum and it is dismantling the legitimacy of occupation. Zionism, in the eyes of many Western powers, especially Europeans who engaged in Holocaust and other atrocities, Zionism was justified. Zionism was seen as just another nationalist liberation movement. But today, people started to give attention to what's happening and started to dismantle the narrative and started to realize that this is the root cause of the problem. This is a fascist, extremist ideology that is causing misery.
Thank you, Muslim. I'll now go to questions, and we are not going to be able to cover every question online, but still, we'll do as much as we can. We might overrun the time a bit in defiance of the president of Aliran, who told me, can we wrap it up at 5? We may not. We need a bit of spirit of resistance, yeah? So one of the questions is, I'll do a short one here. What do you think of the two-state solution of this conflict?
The two-state solution was the very first idea that came to the minds of the international community in 1947. They proposed a partition of the land of Palestine. Had you been living in 1947, you would find it as a ridiculous idea, actually, back then. Because the Palestinians, the Arabs of Palestine, Muslim, Christian, and Jew, by then controlled more than 95 or 96% of their own land. And they've been living there for thousands of years. Suddenly, a migrant community came over to Palestine with arms, with, of course, a plight, because they were persecuted in Europe, the Holocaust and other, persecution that they faced. They came up with an agenda to steal this land. And the international community wanted to solve the problem. So they said, okay, we partition it 50-50, or it wasn't 50-50. They promised the Zionist side 55%. So if I were there, or if you were there, you would say, this is ridiculous. You don't just come and partition it. But sometimes for practical, realistic considerations, you say, okay, let's deal with it. The problem is that Israel is the one that denied the two-state solution from day one. 1947, they were told take 55%, they took 80% through the force of power and military force. In 1967, they stole the rest, the remaining amount. Then over the years, the Arabs, extended olive branch so many times. Sadat in the 1970s, after many wars, he visited Israel, he visited Jerusalem, and he met with the Israeli government and said, okay, let's have peace, but give the Palestinian anything. They didn't give the Palestinian anything. The PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which fought against Israel's colonization for so many decades, eventually agreed to a settlement in which Israel continues to be the power over 80% of Palestine, but the Palestinians get a small portion in the West Bank and Gaza. They signed agreements, they shook hands, they left the podium, but nothing happened. Israel continued to send illegal settlers because this is a settler colonial ideology. They cannot stop it, actually. I understand. Israel cannot stop being settler colonial because this is how they started in the first place. So even if they sign 1 million agreements with you, they will still send settler colonial settler communities. From 1993, when the PLO, when the Palestinians signed to accept the two-state solution and to accept the existence of Israel, Israel sent 1 million illegal settlers to the West Bank, to the supposed Palestinian state. Of course, we couldn't send a single person to Israel.
Sorry, that's after what?
1993.
Oslo.
The Oslo Agreement.
Right.
The Oslo Agreement was signed, and the simple idea was Israel should give the Palestinians something, which is 20% of their historical land. But Israel gave us lip service only. It was actually Netanyahu that killed off this plan since 1996 when he was elected prime minister for the first time. So the Palestinians and the Arabs continue to accept concessions but get nothing in return. So the two-state solution was never accepted by Israel. And today, the mainstream Israeli political institutions, political parties, Knesset, government, they all publicly say no two-state solution. We will never allow a state to emerge from the river to the sea. So when the Palestinians or the pro-Palestine movement chants from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, people say you are genocidal. No, we are talking about emancipation, liberation of the people. But the other side is actually practically implementing a policy of from the river to the sea. No Palestinian will even exist. The US and some powers let go. The two-state solution, maybe this might sound controversial, worked in some cases in other parts of the world. Some would argue, I heard this suggestion from a Malaysian friend, that when Singapore split or quit Malaysia, it was some sort of a two-state solution. It worked. I don't see Singapore now, bombing its neighbors, or Malaysia bombing Singapore. Nobody engaged in genocide or ethnic cleansing. They live in peace. So it can work in certain cases. But in the case of Palestine, because of the Zionist ideology, again, back to Zionism, they cannot. It's like I don't understand them, of course, but they cannot, because the whole idea, the whole myth, the whole lie, the whole narrative was, this is a land without people, for a people without land. We've come from Europe and from other places to cultivate this desert, and we made the desert bloom. Then when you now tell them, give the Palestinians a very, very small state, you actually destroy their logic. You completely destroy the Zionist narrative that they have a right to create their own establishment there. So I don't think they will ever let a Palestinian state emerge. And this will mean the only solution, the only way out is to dismantle apartheid and everybody lives in peace.
Yeah, yeah. So that answer you just gave, Muslim, partially helps to answer another question here, actually, which is, do you recognize UN Resolution 181 of 1947, the partition of Palestine with Israel and Arab borders? So your answer partially helps to answer that question, but actually it leads to another question which was submitted much earlier on, and which is related to this question now and your recent answer, which is, do you recognize Israel's right to exist as a sovereign state? That was the question.
Now, of course, this is a very interesting question because mainstream Western media keeps repeating it. Whenever a Palestinian comes on stage or is being interviewed, these questions pop up. Does Israel have a right to exist? Does Israel have a right to self-defense? Does Israel have this right and that right? But the one that is engaged in genocide is actually Israel. Do political constructs, do political entities have right to exist? That's actually that's not a very valid question, actually. People have right to exist. So the Palestinian people have right to exist. The Jewish people have right to exist. The Malay people have right to exist. The Chinese, the Indian, the Aborigine communities, the Italians, people have right to exist. But political entities have right to exist or not. I don't see anybody asking any other state other than Israel, does Italy have a right to exist? Did the Soviet Union Did the Soviet Union have a right to exist? Did Yugoslavia have a right to exist? Did apartheid South Africa have a right to exist? Did colonial British Malaya have a right to exist? It's a ridiculous question. But of course, because the powerful keeps asking it, it is always, accepted. It's always accepted as a valid question. So the Palestinian people, be it Muslim, Christian, or Jew, the Arab Palestinian people have right to exist. The Jewish people, be it Palestinian Jews, European Jews, Arab Jews, have right to exist. But how to organize politically, this is up to consensus, agreement, discussion, deliberation, or unfortunately, up to military force. Does for instance, Assad regime have right to exist, or the opposition entity have right to? Okay, let's come to Malaysia. Does the Barisan National Administration have right to exist, or the Pakatan Harapan Administration have right to exist, or the Perikatan National Administration have to? These are political constructs. It's up to the people to decide. As long as we respect everybody's right to self-determination, I think we are fine. The problem is that in the case of Israel, nobody respects the Palestinian right to self-determination. Now, nobody, in case of course, the superpowers. The Western superpowers, they don't really respect the Palestinian right to self-determination and to existence. And the US, most particularly, most notably, never respected the Palestinian right to self-determination, in spite of the rhetoric and the lip service, because the policies say otherwise. However, they all recognize Israel's so-called right to exist as a sovereign nation. Okay, let's, for the sake of argument, say some Palestinians agreed that Israel has a right to exist. What are the borders of Israel? No one can answer this. This political entity, if you recognize a political entity, you should be expected to actually define its borders. Israel has no borders. Israel's borders are as far as its troops can reach. So today, they draw their map this way. In 5 years, if anything happens in Syria, they will start to draw their map differently. Until Trump recognized Golan Heights, the Syrian Golan Heights, as Israeli territory, nobody in their right mind would actually accept to draw Israel with the Golan Heights as a part of its territory. But today, the United States officially recognizes the Syrian Golan Heights as an Israeli territory. There are some Lebanese towns which are still being occupied by Israel. So Israel has no defined territory because it's a political construct that was formed upon, and settler colonial expansionist ideology called Zionism. If Zionism is this defunct extremist ideology, if it is defeated, if it is abandoned, the debate will be very different. So I don't know. I certainly don't think Israel as a regime has a right to exist. It's a brutal regime. But the Israeli Jewish people have a right to exist as human beings and right to self-determination. That's a very different issue.
Okay, noted. Thank you. From the floor. There's a line of questions online. I can't believe that there's only one question from the floor so far. Yeah. It's better to attend online then. Okay, so another question online. This is from Dr. Awangku Abdul Rahman from Sarawak. Mr. Imran, what do you think of President-elect Trump's support of Israel in the face of the Iranian threat to Israel? Is he going to green light an all-out attack on Iran?
Of course, President Trump is unpredictable in many cases, except maybe a few. For instance, his economic policies and trade policies. Palestine is one of the predictable policies. When he was in power the first time, he basically endorsed the right-wing Zionist nationalist ideology. Unlike any other previous American president, of course, they were all horrible to the Palestinians. Probably the exception is John Kennedy, but the rest were very Zionist. Biden, for instance, publicly said that if there was no Israel, we should create Israel. And he always identified openly as a Zionist, and he sponsored this genocide in Gaza. But in the case of Trump, he did not support the rational, if there was ever a rational Zionist ideology. He always supported the right-wing Zionist ideology. His team are devout right-wing Zionists who believe that Israel should continue to expand, who believe that Israel should have rule over the Golan Heights of Syria, over the West Bank. They believe that the West Bank should be annexed by Israel. So Trump will continue to completely endorse right-wing policies, not only of Netanyahu, but of Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and the other ultra-nationalist, ultra-religious Israeli politicians. And that's the danger of Trump. So while he might end the war in Ukraine, he will fuel a bigger war in the Middle East. And I don't agree that Iran is a threat to Israel. It is Israel that is a threat to Iran, to Iraq, to Syria, to Lebanon, because up until April this year, Iran has never launched any military attack on Israel up until April. But if you can list it down, Israel has continuously launched attacks on Iran. They killed Iranian nuclear scientists, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, and others many years back. They assassinated many Iranian military and scientist figures. They attacked a Palestinian political leader in Tehran during the presidential inauguration. So Israel has always been the threat. So Trump will unfortunately give a political cover to this threat. Whatever the Israeli right wing wants to do in the region, they will try to do it during Trump's time. That's why I don't think Trump's presidency will bring peace to the Middle East. It might bring peace to other regions for strategic reasons, but not to the Middle East.
So can I just add, just I think a few days ago, it was very problematic that President-elect Donald Trump actually tweeted and said that there will be hell to pay if by the time he swears in as president, the hostages are not released. And that he will, that those responsible will face a whole wrath of, not exact words, but, of the US military might. But what he said was there will be hell to pay for those who are responsible. So, I mean, I think that itself is very problematic. And we know that in the news every day that we see children being killed, women being killed, the bombs, every single day, those bombs and missiles are being supplied in large by the Americans, right? We know that. That's for a fact. I mean, billions and billions of dollars are passed by Congress every year for America to send loads amounts of arms. There are some Democrat congressmen who have tried actually to stop this. They've tried to pass the motions, but they failed in large. So I think until and unless you address this US support of Israel, this I don't see no solution in the short term. In fact, I heard that there was an article written that said that Israel would not, if, for example, the arms were to stop coming into Israel from America, Israel will run out of arms or the ability to strike or carry out military actions within months. They would not be able to sustain their military operations. So, I mean, the solution seems easy enough, but, how do you get, America and these other countries to stop sending arms? And I think, and this all goes back to public opinion.
Yeah.
And this all goes back to what the ICC is doing. I think, for example, when you have arrests of warrant now coming out, you really put many of these European countries at a dilemma as to what to do, right? Because they are all member states. They are all obliged to follow and comply with the orders that come out from the International Criminal Court. So do you arrest Benjamin Netanyahu or, his generals or whoever that steps onto their countries, right? So this becomes a big debate in itself in their countries, right? I mean, I think it's very difficult for governments and elites to justify an order from the International Criminal Court because these are decisions made by a panel of expert judges from around the world. It's not just a Malaysian court order, right? Or whatever. Yeah. So I know we're running out of time. So yeah.
Well, I did say that we would try and extend it a bit. By how long can we extend it? Yeah. Well,
well, did anybody ask when you mentioned that one of the solutions is economic boycott, cultural boycott, sanctions, and so on? Do we have any success stories to share so far?
Yes, definitely. These kinds of tools and instruments will not have an immediate impact. An immediate impact is what the Yemenis are doing. An immediate impact, an immediate intervention that will try to stop the genocide is what Yemen is doing. They blocked the sea. They told Israel, as long as you engage in this genocide, not a single ship will pass through the Red Sea to Israel. But not many other states are willing to actually take it to that level. But economic sanctions will certainly have an impact because the lifestyle of Israelis will change with economic sanctions and divestment from Israel. Now, after 1 year of engaging in war, many actually are leaving Israel for good. There are estimates by Professor, if I'm not mistaken, by Professor Ilan Pape himself, the Israeli historian, that about 700,000 Israelis have left Israel. Yes. Why? Of course, because most Israelis have dual citizens. I mean, their fathers or grandfathers lived for centuries in one of the European countries. The ones who leave during time of war are not the impoverished, abandoned ones, not the ones on the margins. The ones who leave are the ones who have the money, the ones who have the ability to leave. So what's happening in Israel because of this global boycott and global pressure on Israel, pressure is not necessarily through only boycott, but it's a collective move. What's happening is that the whole Zionist project, the whole system, the whole experiment, Zionist experiment, is coming to an end. It's collapsing. It takes time, though. The Soviet Union, for instance, was an experiment. The Marxist, thinkers and the Marxist political groups came together, took over power through a revolution, and they ruled for how many years? 1917 all the way to 1990, 80 years or less, 70 years. Then eventually it came to an end. What's happening now is similar, of course, with the different moral connotation for each side. The Zionist experiment is coming to an end. It's taking time. It's painful. They are in denial. They are bombing the hell out of everybody because they are in decline. And that's what's happened. What happens when somebody is in denial? Their economy is slowly collapsing. Zero tourism in Israel now. They used to claim always that they are a startup nation where entrepreneurs and technology savvy people should come and invest. Who in their right mind will go and invest now in that sector in Israel? Of course, they are one of the producers of defense technologies, security, and so on. October the 7th, and their failure in Gaza in 1 year, and their failure in southern Lebanon is actually persuading many of their customers not to waste money on Israeli technology. Because, for instance, the Israeli Merkava tank, one of the most sophisticated tanks in the world, $3 or $4 million. Palestinian fighters using locally made rocket launchers, locally made RPGs, which I don't know, might probably cost $100, $200, can actually blow up an Israeli military tank that costs $3 or $4 million. So even the security business is also suffering. The failure in October 7th to predict what happened was alone also a big blow to Israel's intelligence technology and products. So what I'm saying is that one approach might not be enough. We need a collective approach. We need economic boycott. We need divestment. We need cultural boycott. We need academic boycott, and it's happening especially in Europe. We need of course, political pressure. If we manage to expel Israel out of the United Nations General Assembly, for instance, or to designate it as a rogue state, if we get the ICG ruling out, the ICC case to go through, we are talking about a collective approach. We don't want the 5 million Israelis to die. Some people think that, the Palestinians, because of all the pain, they just want to throw everybody in the sea. This is ridiculous. We want an end to this political occupation, this colonial regime. We want it to be dismantled. We want to live in peace and dignity. How to bring an end to a political regime? You have to use all the tools, even domestically in some of the authoritarian regimes, for instance. The opposition will use all tools at their disposal. I don't want to mention any example, so I don't go into controversies. But if you want to change a political regime, you can engage in so many approaches. One of them is demonstrations, public demonstration. One of them is boycott. One of them is, diplomatic efforts. One of them is political efforts, campaigning, advocacy. There are a million ways. When people give up, it's because they don't see the big picture. What you're doing by boycotting that specific coffee brand is actually very impactful, because when 2, 3, 5, 10 shops close, and at the end of the quarter they see that they are actually making loss. Today, this person might be a Zionist himself or herself, and they will say, no, we carry on. We continue to issue statements in support of Israel in spite of the loss. But tomorrow, the board of directors will question him or her and say, hey, we want to make money. We don't want to continue to invest in colonization and invest in apartheid. We want to make, even if they don't have moral, incentives, they will, for material, economic reasons, decide to pull out of Israel. Many companies are doing that right now. Imagine when this becomes an international trend, like what happened to South Africa, apartheid South Africa. The Zionist regime will come to an end. Maybe not Netanyahu, maybe another prime minister after him will come to their senses and say, enough. Enough colonization, enough apartheid, enough illegal settlements, enough detention of Palestinians, enough. If this doesn't happen in Israel, I think it will happen in the US and the Western world, and it is happening. You see, in the last 1 year, Spain recognized the state of Palestine. It took them 30 years since Oslo Accord. They never bothered about doing that. Suddenly now they did, because their people, the Spanish people, are fed up. Slovenia recognized the state of Palestine. Ireland recognized the state of Palestine. The Asian and African nations have long recognized Palestine. The change is not in Malaysia or in, in Indonesia or in Zimbabwe or Mozambique. The change is actually in the US, in Western Europe. And this will certainly have an impact. So our role here is the butterfly effect to actually make it bigger. I think boycott in the US makes more sense and has a bigger impact than boycott in Malaysia. But when you do it in Malaysia, you actually encourage others to do it everywhere else.
Picking up on your point about advocacy, Muslim being one of the modes of action amongst many. One of the tasks of advocacy, of course, is to engage or address points that challenge back what is being advocated. So that brings me actually to one of the follow-up questions online. This is from Chi Lim Chang, and this is in relation to the earlier answer, which had spoken about two states, that Israel wouldn't accept two states at its core, ultimately, because that's against the core of Zionist ideology to begin with. But this relates to the partition of 1947, UN General Resolution 181 in 1947. And the question here is that, upon the resolution that was passed by the UN 181, the question is, who started the attack after UN Resolution 181? Please get historical facts right.
Yeah.
Your opportunity to answer.
Thank you very much. Okay, first of all, the Palestinians were not consulted by the United Nations when the UN General Assembly passed the resolution to partition Palestine. So there were a few 100,000 Palestinians. Not a single Palestinian was consulted. Meanwhile, the Zionist movement, the Jewish agency, the establishment, the Zionist establishment in Palestine was not only consulted, they were actually the government in Palestine. The commissioner, high commissioner, the British officer who was running Palestine was actually a Zionist. So they plotted with the British the future of Palestine. But anyway, to get my facts right, when the United Nations decided to partition Palestine, 29th of November, 1947, which is, interestingly now, the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. This is a day acknowledged by the United Nations itself. The 29th of November, 1947, the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. The next day after this declaration, the Zionist troops stormed into Palestinian towns. They did not wait a single day. Professor Ilan Pape, in his book, Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, which is based on declassified Israeli military documents. So Ilan Pape did not go and interview Palestinians about what happened in 1947. He went to the archives of the Zionist Israeli state, which were declassified 50 years later, 1947 plus 50, 1997. He and many other Israeli historians, actually, and the group is now called the New Historians, they went to the archives, they started to study what did Ben Gurion think? What did the Palmach, what did the Haganah, what did Stern, what did all these Israeli military groups think in 1947? They not only planned to take over Palestine and to commit ethnic cleansing, they actually had a specific plan called the Dalit Plan to commit ethnic cleansing. Now it's well documented. Anybody can go and read this book and other books. They put plans, they put maps, how to get rid of the people, the Palestinian people in Haifa, how to get rid of the Palestinian people in Ramla, how to get rid of the Palestinian people in the south. And it worked. They put plans, they took action, they started storming Palestinian towns and cities, and eventually 500 Palestinian towns were completely wiped out. Where is the historical Palestinian city of Jaffa? If you check now the map, you will find a small mosque and a few towns of an old city called Jaffa, with a few Palestinian people living there. Above Jaffa is Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv, of course, they started building it a bit earlier, next to Jaffa. Eventually, the big historical city of Jaffa, which was the main port in Palestine for centuries, was wiped out, and a new Zionist city called Tel Aviv was created upon Jaffa. In many towns which they did not want to inhabit, they bulldozed buildings and they erected pine trees. That's why in Palestine we have a lot of pine trees. You know why? Pine tree is not very indigenous to Palestine, by the way. That's why every few years there is a big fire that happens. We have some pine trees, but it's not big forests. Israel planted thousands of pine trees to cover the Palestinian towns and cities. Anybody going to Palestine now, especially those who have some Western passports that allow you to travel to Israel, pick a map and start searching. There are now many books documenting these 500 Palestinian towns and cities. So to say that who started invasion first, it was actually the Zionist movement starting invasion before the partition plan. Many Zionist groups like Stern, Haganah is the main group. Stern and the name is Ergun and Stern and others. They not only attacked the Palestinians in 1947, for the last 2, 3, or 5 years, they attacked the British troops themselves. These groups bombed King David Hotel, for instance, in Jerusalem, killing dozens of British envoys and diplomats and Jewish and Palestinian people. They committed terrorist acts. The British administration used to actually sometimes persecute some of these extremist Zionist groups. They were plotting with the mainstream Zionist movement, the Haganah, the Jewish Agency, but at the same time, they didn't like the more radical ones. The Zionist militias attacked and killed and persecuted Palestinians even before 47. In 1947, it was the mainstream Zionist group, the Haganah, taking action. They started what they call the War of Liberation, quote unquote, or War of Independence, which was a war of ethnic cleansing. And only in May 1948, when they officially declared the establishment of Israel, that the Arab armies came to save Palestine. It was too late. I think the one who asked the question refers to this. The Arab armies came to save what was left of Palestine in May 1948, which was too late. In 6 months, the Zionist movement had already controlled most of the historical land of Palestine, and they already built their institutions, they already controlled the resources, they already secured all the economic facilities, they already drove out hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. So what was left is to finish off the unfinished business. The Arab armies were 7 of them, yes, but in total, by the end of the war, their numbers were less than half the numbers of the Zionist troops. Of course, this is one of the myths. They always say the Zionist David defeated the Arab Goliath. It was actually the other way around. The Arab troops that came to save the Palestinians were ill-equipped, ill-trained, and interestingly, the chief commander of the Arab troops that came to save Palestine in May 1948 was a British officer. The chief of the Jordanian army was a British officer. Most of the senior generals in the Jordanian army were British officers. So the British handed over Palestine to the Zionist movement in one hand and sent some British troops to lead the Arab armies to save Palestine from the Zionist movement. It was very ridiculous. It was one of the, when you read about it, you don't know, you should laugh or you should cry. It's embarrassing.
I think colonialism has its wonderful aspects, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, what you're saying is really after 181 was passed in the UN,
The Israeli troops started marching.
literally the day after passing of the resolution,
Veng-
Israeli troops were already
Yes, marching.
exercising fear, intimidation, expulsion of Palestinian villagers.
Yes.
And in fact, from what I can recall of that book that you mentioned earlier on, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, those acts of ethnic cleansing actually started even before the 29th of November,
Yes, yes.
1948. It started before. So the question is not even who started it first. You know, it was actually started before 181.
I
And that's
suggest
how-
another book in addition to ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is an academic work.
Yeah, but it's important in the sense that as you
Yeah,
also
it's
mentioned,
well
the
documented, yeah.
sources are from
Jewish,
actually
Israeli sources.
Jewish, Zionist, military sources themselves, including the diary of Ben Gurion.
And they're not shy about saying that we won a war. We were more powerful. We won the war. If you read Netanyahu's not biography, but one of his writings in the 1990s, A Place Among Nations or A Place Under the Sun. If you read it and you read Mein Kampf of Hitler, you won't see much difference. The amount of arrogance, the amount of glorification of power and military power, especially is there. We are powerful, so we deserve to control this.
Yeah.
The same logic applied. A good book to read actually about the Nakba, what we call the catastrophe, 1947, 1948, ethnic cleansing, is a novel written by an Egyptian novelist, the mother of the most famous Palestinian poet now, Tamim Barghouti. Tamim Barghouti is a very famous Palestinian poet, Arabic poet. His mother, Radwa Ashur, is an Egyptian novelist. She wrote a book entitled Tanturiya, the girl from Tantura. Tantura is a small town near Haifa, in which a massacre was committed. Read that novel if you like. If you don't like academic works, read that novel. It's based on a true story. Unfortunately, we are not that good in cinema yet, so you wouldn't find many catchy movies. But there are actually some. I think there are a few on Netflix. Farha, Present, a few of them. But yeah, if you are to read a book, Tantura is a must read. The Girl from Tantura or Ethnic Cleansing of Ilan Pape.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go for the last question now, which has to come from the floor. There is one hand up there. And my apologies to the rest of the questions online. I don't think we have the time to do that. Kevin from the floor.
It's just a really simple question. You mentioned earlier that Zionism as an ideology is dying. And do you think that Palestinian liberation is imminent? And the second part of that question is, what does Palestinian liberation look like to you?
Okay, this is not simple questions. It's difficult questions, actually. The simplest questions are the most difficult questions. Okay, Zionism is dying, but not internally, unfortunately. The Zionist state and the Zionist political institutions are dying. Before October the 7th, if you remember, if you used to follow the news of the region, there was a real serious internal crisis in Israel. Netanyahu was trying to transform the Israeli system, which is a Jewish-only democracy. It's a democracy for the Jewish people, actually. He was trying to transform it into a more authoritarian regime. So he had his judicial amendments, which basically turned Israel into a more religious, ethnocratic regime. They had huge demonstrations in the hundreds of thousands. They had many people boycotting the army, boycotting the state institutions, judges passing, all sorts of statements. Israel was in crisis. But unfortunately, the Zionist ideology was not being dismissed by the Zionist people themselves. The Zionist ideology was transforming into an ultra-nationalist, ultra-religious ideology. So what happened is in Nazi Germany, for instance, after the defeat of Nazism, most of the German people abandoned Zionism, abandoned Nazism. And it's very hard to find, a big following now, although there are new Nazi groups. But in Israel, what happened since the year 2000 until now is that the Israeli society has been shifting right, continuously. Every election, they shift further. So in 2000, an Israeli right-wing government, 2001, I think, an Israeli right-wing government came to power under Adun Sharon. There were a few members in his government who believed in the temple, in reconstructing the temple upon or above the location of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. And they did not believe in two states at all. But since then, the governments that have been winning elections are only right-wing governments, except for a very short period 2 years ago when Yair Lapid and Bennett formed a unity government. But in this unity government, the opposition was 100% right-wing, ultra-nationalist, ultra-religious. But the unity government, which the opposition so-called left-wing formed, was half right-wing. The first prime minister of that temporary government was Bennett. Bennett is, if you have a spectrum, he is to the right of Netanyahu, on the right of Netanyahu. Any future Israeli administration will have at least 90% of its component parties from the right wing. The Israeli left wing, which established Israel, which was still Zionist, but more rational Zionist, secular Zionist, has now 4 or 5 members of the Knesset. That's it. And so when you talk about Israeli society, the problem is that Zionism is not being defeated internally, not through intellectual discourse. It is actually becoming a more monstrous ideology. To be defeated internally, maybe they need to be defeated externally. It's too powerful. They are too arrogant to question themselves. Somebody has to put a stop to their expansion and their arrogance. Then maybe they will start to question themselves, just like what happened in Germany. As for the Palestinian national movement, the first question is it imminent? The second one is, what do I think of the Palestinian national? I think the Palestinian people have tried everything in 100 years. They tried military resistance, they tried civil disobedience, they tried political resistance, diplomatic resistance. They tried nothing at certain periods of times. They tried submission, they tried sitting in the corner and crying alone. They tried everything. But we were not able to achieve our liberation, not because we haven't tried enough, not because our people aren't brave enough to actually struggle, but because the whole problem was bigger than our capabilities. It was not created in Palestine. It was not created by the Jewish people of Europe alone. The Palestinian problem was created by the superpowers. There were geopolitical shifts in the early 20th century. The Zionist movement was successful to plot with some of the colonial powers like Britain, France, and others. And when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the Palestinian land and the Palestinian people were subject to a colonial rule. How many, I don't know the figures, but how many troops, British troops occupied Malaya when they came over, or Dutch troops occupied Indonesia? I'm not sure, but I think it's in the tens of thousands. When the British occupied Palestine, they sent 120,000 troops. So we really tried to fight back. We and whoever was the government back then. In 1920, the Palestinians started civilian protests. In 1929, Al-Buraq Revolution, a very vigorous public protest movement continued for weeks. We lost many people. They were always repressed. In 1935, the Palestinians opted to try military resistance for the first time, and they organized themselves under the leadership of a Syrian national liberation figure, Izzeddin al-Qassam. If I'm sure you heard of this name. Now there is a Qassam Brigades, a Palestinian resistance force. The name is actually after a Syrian revolutionary who was expelled by the French in the 1920s and settled in Palestine and led the Palestinian resistance in 1935. 1936 all the way to 1939. The Great Palestinian Revolution continued for 3 years. We, as Palestinian revolutionaries, especially the rural, communities, were able to force out the British from 50% of the Palestinian territories. But what happened in 1939? Second World War started, so the superpower crushed us and continued its occupation. In 1948, the Palestinians fought along other Arab armies against occupation. 1965, the Palestinians organized themselves into different resistance groups like Fatah, Popular Front, General Command, Democratic Front, and others, and resisted through military force, through diplomatic efforts. The PLO tried everything. Every single idea was tried. 1987, we had the uprising, the first Intifada for 6 years. 2000, second Intifada. In 1993, we tried the peace process. So we tried everything. It did not start in Palestine. This is what I started my presentation with. The problem was started in Europe. by superpowers. They designed Israel. They created Israel. So for us to liberate ourselves, our efforts alone might not be enough. It doesn't mean we're going to sit idle. We will try our best, but we need a shift in the international political order, and it is happening now. The US, which completely endorses Israel's occupation of Palestine, is not the hegemon it used to be. Since 1990 until 2017-18, the US was the only sole dominant power. Today, there are many contenders. There is BRICS. China is challenging them. Russia is challenging them. Iran is challenging them. So the Palestinians, we don't want to get involved in global geopolitics, but we have no choice but to, hop on the rivaling factions. Not that we want to get involved in China-America rivalry, but I don't think the US will do justice to the Palestinians ever. I think we have to count on every friend that is willing to support our struggle. And we tried everything, but the biggest achievement the Palestinians have done, and I finish with this, is that they continue to exist. Our brothers in North America, the Red Indians, are now history. You go to see them in museums. The Aborigines in Australia are now history. We in Palestine, thankfully, because of the grace of God, continue to exist. They killed many of us, yes. They expelled many of us, yes, but we're still demanding our rights. Some people think this is irrational, but I think we have no other choice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Muslim. Muslim, if any of the audience wish to send follow-up questions, and you're the director of the
Asia Middle East Center.
Asia Middle East Center for Dialogue and Research, would that be the right channel to channel questions so that people can get answers?
Okay, I am on social media unless I'm banned. I was banned from Facebook before. You can reach out to me directly. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, or you can send to our think tank. We have social media outlets, I think, on all main, or through you as well.
Yeah, it could be CC through Aliran.
Yeah. I don't mind sharing my phone number with anyone interested to have a conversation.
Yeah, but for right now, what name or channel do we tell the audience?
If they are on Twitter, you can send directly to me on my Twitter
Muslim
feed,
Imran.
Muslim
Twitter.
Imran.
Okay.
If you are on Instagram, I go also by the same name. If you are unable to find my page, you can send to Asia Middle East Center social media outlets. Okay. We have an Instagram page, TikTok, no TikTok,
Asia
Instagram,
Middle East
Twitter,
Center for Research.
We have a website. The email is there as well.
Right. Okay.
And I welcome anyone interested to have a conversation in our office in Kuala Lumpur.
Yeah.
And hopefully I'll come again to Penang.
But there are many people from Kuala Lumpur, and there are questions still that still challenging. So it's good to keep addressing those challenging questions. Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you again, Muslim, and thank you everyone.